So let's look at the planes first. Sagittal, frontal, transverse. Look, your boy went through it. Sometimes, depending on where you go to school, some of you may have seen the words, if you've seen this before, rather than frontal, you may have seen the word coronal. And it's like, it's just like miles per hour in kilometers. Like we're just going to switch those up depending on where we're at. Like it's tough out there, right? So sagittal, let's break this down. I want to make this real English. I find the picture of the people that with the lines through them makes it harder for me. Sagittal plane is anything flexion extension, right? So flex the bicep curl, sagittal plane exercise. Front raise, right? Doing a dumbbell front raise, sagittal plane exercise. Squatting. Now, there's quite literally some dimension to this. Straight leg raise. Let's think of just a straight leg raise or leg raises as an exercise, like some sort of core exercise, sagittal plane, right? Hip flexion, elbow flexion, shoulder flexion, knee extension flexion, all of these, anything that goes front to back, we would call a sagittal plane exercise, right? Now, frontal, this is key. And this is where we're going to dig in on gait cycle just a little bit. And this is where when we talk about just takeaways, things that we can like immediately apply to our training that we may not have overlooked, but our principles-based approach and maybe improving lower body mechanics very simply with applying some of these things that we learned about gait cycle. Frontal plane is big. So frontal plane is side to side, right? Now, you may be thinking side to side, like lateral lunges. It's like, well, maybe, kind of, ish. We'll talk about why frontal plane is so important. And lastly, we have the transverse plane. Transverse plane is rotation, right? So anything spinning, right? This transverse plane, right? This transverse plane, right? So rotation, transverse plane. Now, these movements are very interesting in the way they organize. So you kind of see this, like, all right, let's pose a question. If we were to turn on a highlight reel right now, if we were to turn on ESPN or TSN or wherever you guys are in the world, I don't know what the equivalent of that is in Singapore. I'm sorry, but like we were to put on like a highlight reel, especially this time of year, and it was like plays of the night. Plays of the night in sports are usually high velocity, which means very fast, transverse plane movements. I have not maybe once when Ray Williams squatted like 1,000 pounds, saw powerlifting on there, but usually like dunk contest. It's Tony Hawk pro skater without the skateboard now. Some guy is just jumping with a basketball. It's like, why? High velocity. It's going very, very, very fast and it's rotating, right? What's the most boring thing to watch? Powerlifting, probably, right? Low velocity, predominantly sagittal plane. Like your hips are flexing and extending and it's kind of slow if it's really heavy. So it's like, okay, our body tends to have a more difficult time operating in the transverse plane, right? Transverse plane is harder. It's just, a lot of it has to do with how our head kind of exists in space and the vestibular system. And if I start moving my head around, I kind of get a little bit disoriented. So sagittal plane is very simple. And we see this, right? Like if you've ever seen, like someone elderly walk, you'll notice that they lose a lot of rotation. They might start to waddle side to side. It's like, yeah, because they actually can't rotate as well as they used to, right? So they kind of adopt this more simple strategy of getting around, which simplicity comes from when we move from transverse to frontal to sagittal. Complexity comes when we move the opposite direction, right? So if I need to make a movement more complex, I'll move it from sagittal to frontal. And if I need to make it more complex again, I'll move it from frontal to transverse, right? There's plenty of different examples that we could talk about this, but I want to talk about how this pertains to gait cycle, right? So if we look at gait cycle, there's three kind of purposes of gait cycle, and it's kind of true of like muscles in general, right? So gait cycle has three main components to it. Now we could zoom out and be like, well, gait cycle has two phases, right? So the two phases of gait cycle are going to be early stance, mid stance, and late stance. So that's part of the stance phase. So zoom all the way out. We have stance phase, which means, hey, there's one leg on the ground. And then we have the other part of the cycle, which is swing phase. Hey, we have a foot in the ground. And between going and alternating between what we call stance phase on one leg with a leg on the ground and swing phase with the leg in the air. And we have a like 10% called double support phase in between, where if you're walking, we have both feet on the ground, right? So we're finishing terminal stance on the one side while we're adopting early stance on the other side, right? So we call that the double support phase. And then as my heel touches the ground, I'm absorbing force and everything that comes with that biomechanically up into the knee and the tibia and the pelvis and so on. And then when I solely am on one foot, right? So as I've shifted, and this is going to be really big, when I'm in, what we call mid stance, I'm in a good position to produce force. And then as I go into late stance, That's where I transfer force, right? So when we look at these two, and we go, okay, sagittal, frontal, transverse, and the purpose of gait cycle is to absorb, produce, and transfer force. One of the things that I think is really important as like a good place to start is what are the issues we have primarily, right? When it comes to the pelvis, when it comes to lower body, it's like one of the biggest ones that we're going to have is is a hip shift, right? So a hip shift can be very daunting to people. Like, oh, I don't understand what's happening. Do I have a leg length indiscrepancy? Am I stronger on my one side? So look, your body is just a series of like electrical impulses, right? Driven through mechanotransduction and charges and ions, and it's just as may you this storm in your head, and it's synapses and nerve endings and all that. If you ever look at lightning, you ever see it hit something, hopefully it's something, hopefully it's not someone, and you watch the trajectory that lightning takes the path of least resistance. When it comes to completing tasks in your body with your nervous system, central and peripheral, it's finding the path of least resistance. So we could surmise that if we see a hip shift, and this is like a very narrow lens to look through, but I think, in the interest of trying to talk to 98 strangers without seeing their face about a topic that I'm unsure of their baseline knowledge of, I'm going to try and give a few very practical takeaways of like, okay. And then a few hopefully higher level principle takeaways where those who might be a little bit further along can start to really chew on and maybe find some interesting solutions for problems that might be having. So that being said, the hip shift, path of least resistance, the lightning. If I see someone shifting to their hip, shifting to one side of their squat, what that tells me, and how I know this or how I'm getting to this conclusion is I'm getting to it through the principles of gait cycle. What that tells me is they're shifting towards the side that has more internal rotation, right? Because they are not being able to sort of capture or access the range of motion on the other side. And in order to produce force, we need to be able to internally rotate. Gait cycle taught us that. Now let's think about that really quickly. I'm going to bring the mic. I wonder how far I can bring it. Is that as far as I can go? Yes. Okay. So hopefully you can still hear me. I'm back here now, and this offers no strategic advantage. Okay. So as I take a step forward towards the camera, okay, so my left leg is forward. In order for me to advance towards you, I need to be able to move my pelvis through the frontal plane, right? I need to be able to move it to the side. Now, in order for this to happen, in order for this to be achieved in a fruitful and productive manner, is as I'm taking this step forward and I take my left foot and I step forward and I want to advance now into mid stance. So now, oh, okay, this one is swinging, right? So I'm in swing phase of my right leg. In order for that to be useful, we need to think about what happens at the pelvis in what we call the closed chain, right? So when we hear the importance of what we call internal rotation of the hip, sometimes we can get into the habit of like trying to improve internal rotation of the hip by like thinking about just the hip, right? Thinking about the leg moving on a femur that's fixed, or sorry, the leg moving on a pelvis that's fixed. But what we need to do is we need to think about relative internal rotation. So let's take this mic, for example. Okay, so this mic, imagine this is the end of my femur, right? So I'm going to talk into it, make sure you still hear me. So this is my femur head. It kind of like has this inward trajectory. And this, my hand, is the socket, right? So if I have this mic, the femur head that's sitting in the socket, and I wanted to create rotation, right? Some people will be like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to do this. And I'm going to take my leg and rotate it inside my acetabular or inside my belt. It's like, okay, sure. Problem with that is, look, I've had some squats get away from me in my life, but never once have I ended up doing some like Michael Jackson Thriller shit with my leg in the air, right? That's not how we're trying to get down. We need the foot on the ground. So how is it that we create internal rotation of the hip while our foot stays on the ground, while our femur face fixed? We need to be able to shift, right? We need to be able to shift that center of mass over the base support, which is a concept we'll talk about here in a second.